Thank you all so much for joining us for Boston Tabloid, The Killing of Robin Benedict. Author Don Stradley is here to discuss his brand new book, Boston Tabloid, in this Zoom webinar. So Don is the author of several previous books, including The War, Hagler Hearns and the Three Rounds for the Ages, Berserk, The Shocking Life and Death of Edwin Valero, Slaughter in the Streets, When Boston Became Boxing's Murder Capital, and A Fistful of Murder, The Fights and Crimes of Carlos Monzon. Slaughter in the Streets, by the way, was named by Crime Reads back in 2020 as one of the classics of boxing literature. Don has also written articles. He was a journalist for many local newspapers in the area, many of which you are probably familiar with. A little bit about the book. The disappearance of a 21-year-old woman from a Massachusetts suburb became one of the most discussed crimes of the 20th century. The discussion intensified when the public learned that she worked as a prostitute in Boston's notorious red light district known as the Combat Zone, and she was linked by a trail of blood to a famous professor from Tufts University. When Robin Benedict vanished, the investigation and media circus that gripped the city of Boston hadn't been seen since the days of the Boston Strangler. On a Sunday morning in March 1983, a small-time pimp walked into a police station and claimed that his girlfriend was missing. He said she had been on her way to visit a client named William Douglas. In the year that followed, the case drew in detectives, state troopers, scores of journalists, and even psychics. But Robin was never found. And so Don's book, Boston Tabloid, reconstructs a grisly murder and explores one man's bizarre obsession. And in revisiting this legendary crime, Don consulted journalists involved in the media frenzy, prison authorities, arresting officers, and psychiatrists, all in an effort to unravel a most tangled story. Why was the city and the nation swept up in this sordid tale? It remains a grim and fascinating moment in Boston's history. So all 100 of us or so, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Don for joining us here tonight. And Don, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Robert, I'm going to take you with me wherever I go. That was a great intro. I hope I can live up to it. Well, thank you to everyone who is out there listening. I really appreciate everyone tuning in. That shows me that this case still generates a lot of interest. And I'm going to hold up the book cover if you haven't had a chance to see it. I think you may have seen it in the advertisement for tonight's event. This case was of particular interest to me because I remember being a very, very young guy in 1983, 84, when this event, this magnificent media event seemed to sweep across Boston. It was a case where, as you just heard in the introduction, a professor from Tufts University was accused of murdering a Boston prostitute. The case fascinated Boston's newspaper readers for a lot of reasons. And it was in the news, trust me, almost every day for about a year. It wasn't like today, where when a crime happens today, you might get the initial blast on the internet, maybe a little bit of news coverage, but then it fades after a short time. This case about the professor went on for months and months and months. And it was the kind of case where I discuss it with my friends, I discuss it with people at work, your neighbors would sort of casually mention it. It was just in the news every day. And while I was working on this book last year, what I noticed, what seemed to strike me about the case was that it was all about secret lives. It was a professor who was this well-regarded scientist. He had a worldwide reputation, William Douglas, and he was teaching at Tufts Medical School, but he had a worldwide reputation. He was a really cutting-edge scientist, doing a lot of work with tissue culture. He was a groundbreaker. He would probably go into the history books if he had kept going as a scientist. But he had this other side to his personal life. He loved prostitutes. He loved pornography. I think now we'd probably refer to him as a sex addict or a porn addict. Back then, those kind of labels didn't really exist yet. It was right on the verge of hearing about the expression a sex addict or sexual addiction. That was a brand new term. It wasn't really used very often, but I think he would certainly qualify. But at the time, the newspapers latched onto this guy and tried to describe him as a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type of character. And I think that was one of the reasons it was in the newspapers every day, for our entertainment, because that's what it really became. It was our entertainment every morning to read about this creepy professor who would leave the medical school when his classwork was over. And in Boston, he was just a few blocks away from what they used to call the combat zone, which was Boston's adult entertainment district. It's no longer there. The city officials did away with it. But back then, right around the corner from where this professor worked, you could find prostitutes, drug dealers, porno bookshops, X-rated movie theaters. It was a booming little area full of neon and dangerous types of people wandering around. And also, you would see local people walking around too. You had to go there sometimes just to catch a bus out of the city, or there were still restaurants there. So sometimes you would sort of brave the neighborhood just to get to a certain restaurant. It was right near Chinatown. So it became fairly common, if you wanted to visit Chinatown, you would kind of sweep through the combat zone. And I think that was how Douglas was able to enter this neighborhood, was sort of in the guise, he was a regular fella, just a teacher from the nearby university. And if anybody spotted him, he could just say, "Oh, I'm on my way to a restaurant." But really, he was on his way to find prostitutes, because that was what he liked. He had a long-going relationship with the combat zone. I think that was another point that made this story so tasty for the news media at that time, was because the combat zone was kind of notorious. Everybody knew about the combat zone, but not everybody went there. So the newspapers at the time, the Globe and the Herald, and the TV stations, when they covered this case, they always gave you a big dollop of the combat zone. A lot of that atmosphere, they always tried to get some of that into the story. So it wasn't just a professor and a prostitute. It was a professor, a prostitute, and a combat zone, which was a major selling point. Everybody wanted to hear about the combat zone, and they wanted to hear about this Jekyll and Hyde character. I don't think he was really a Jekyll and Hyde. I think he was just a sort of a sex addict, a porn addict. He was a guy with a lot of darker issues that he kept a secret from his family. And it was that secret life that really fascinated the news media. You were not just reading about the professor. It was a man with a secret life. And it made you wonder, well, who else do I know that has a secret life? You started wondering about your own secret life. did you have things that you tried to hide from people? And you could always look at William Douglas and say, well, no matter what I do, I'm not as bad as this guy. Now, even Robin Benedict, the woman who would eventually be his victim, his murder victim, even she had a secret life. She was a 20-year-old woman from Methuen, originally from Methuen. And she was, at one point, she was a promising art student. She had a background in art. She was taking classes in Rhode Island, the Rhode Island School of Design. But at some point, rather mysteriously, she became a prostitute. And the newspapers naturally ate that up. When they weren't writing about William Douglas's secret life, you know, they were writing all about Robin Benedict's secret life. How did this, you know, well-dressed, educated art school student, how did she become a prostitute? That became a big issue of the day as well. Especially early on, the newspapers weren't coming out and saying she was a prostitute. They were keeping a little bit tight-lipped about that. It was no secret, but they were keeping it a little bit close to the vest. And it wasn't until the trial was approaching where it became okay. We're going to say she's a prostitute, and then all bets were off. Pretty much every headline for the next 6 weeks, you know, had the word prostitute or hooker or combat zone. It really exploded, much to the detriment of her family, because her family didn't understand why the media had to focus so much on that aspect of it, which is something that went on for the next several years. Even after the case was long closed, the parents were still really upset and aggravated that this dead girl was only remembered as a prostitute. So if you buy this book or read it from the library, I really approached it from a lot of different angles. I couldn't approach it as a whodunit, because we all know who done it. It was the professor, you know. So there's really no mystery. But I tried to keep it flowing, as sort of a page turner. So I don't spill everything at once, even though it just sounds like I just said an awful lot about the case. I tried to parcel it out. So the murder case, it's only about the first half of the book. The second half of the book is the media frenzy, which to me was every bit as interesting as the murder case itself. The media approached this case, particularly the Boston Globe. Boston Globe at the time was considered sort of the snooty suburban paper. But when this case started getting on the radar, the Boston Globe decided we can cover this case and we can become the city paper. We can become gritty like the Boston Herald. Now, at the time, the Boston Herald had just been purchased by Rupert Murdoch, and it had changed into a full-blown tabloid. It hadn't always been a tabloid. But once Rupert Murdoch bought it, they started focusing on crimes and drugs and prostitutes. And this case was perfect for the Herald. But the Globe wanted a piece of that action. The Globe wanted to challenge the Herald on its own turf. So the Globe got as down and dirty as the Herald for this particular case. And it was really interesting to see, almost like the two papers were at war with each other. It was a newspaper war. And one of the reporters I spoke to, he said, hey, it was fun. Newspaper wars are fun. It was just a sort of a battle to see, who could get some little bit of information, who could get it on the front page first. And also, what surprised me a little bit was that the investigators and the district attorneys started kind of playing to particular reporters. And as one attorney said to me, they all got pretty good at figuring out who to talk to. If a reporter saw a guy, or if a reporter wanted to be, if an investigator wanted to be in the Boston Globe that day, he knew who to talk to. And it reached a point where, the attorneys were feeding information to the paper that they liked better. And because the Globe had the bigger circulation, the investigators and the attorneys started playing to the Globe, which I thought that was a little bit low, but it was that kind of case. It just, spilled across both the Herald and the Globe. And that went on long after the case was closed. There was this rivalry, a city rivalry between the two papers that hadn't been quite as strong before. I don't want to say that this case, started the rivalry, but it had something to do with it. Now, of course, the Globe and the Herald are totally different newspapers. You wouldn't, you couldn't imagine them now getting so deeply involved in a murder case like this. There would not be as much at stake. There would be probably less, less incentive to get this story on the front page, because not only is the way we get our news different now. We don't really get the big broadsheet and sit at the breakfast table reading the news anymore. Some of us do, but for the most part, we get our news on our telephone screen, or on our laptop. So if you do see a front page spread, it's much smaller. It's not quite as impressive. Now, I remember, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening remember, if you saw a front page, even on the newsstand, it was enormous. There would be this big front page photo, and the big story of the day would, it would grab your attention from 20 feet away. And that's why the professor, Bill Douglas, and Robin Benedict, they became almost like media figures in their own way, because you would see their huge faces in the newspaper on the front page almost every morning for several weeks in a row. And the effect was really intense. I remember it that way. But it would be very different today. You don't get that big splash page phenomenon that you did 30, 35, 40 years ago. And another thing that has changed in this era, 2000, soon to be 2023, I don't know if this story would get as much press, because now the press is focusing a lot on political and social stories. Back then, the crime story really had a lot more weight, and it would get that front page. Now, there's always sort of something about Donald Trump, something about social issues, racial issues. That is sort of the dominating news feature now. So this type of murder story, it would get picked up, but it would probably not be on page one every day the way it was in 1983, 84. So I thought it was a great idea to explore this story. My publisher and I were having dinner, must have been a year and a half ago, trying to come up with another idea that we could pursue. I'd done a few books for him, and we just started talking about Boston crimes. The Chuck Stewart case was a big one, and the Whitey Bulger stories, they've been done too much, I think. And then both of us almost simultaneously mentioned William Douglas and Robin Benedict. Do you remember that? And he remembered it the same way I did, as just this massive story that seemed to take over the city. And I thought, okay, I'll see what I can do about this case. And what another thing that was interesting to me was that Douglas he lived in Sharon, and Robin was initially from Methuen, though she was living in Malden at the time she was killed. But the story never became a Sharon story, and it never became a Malden or Methuen story. It was always a Boston story. And I spoke to one writer, a reporter from Lawrence, which is right near Methuen. And he told me, he said his editor at the Lawrence newspaper told him, let's make this story our own, give it a lot of coverage, and he really tried, but he even admitted that it was a city story, it was a Boston story. And I imagine it was because of the combat zone. The combat zone was where the professor met this prostitute, and that became really the magnet, the hook for the story. If the combat zone had been in Methuen, it would have become a Methuen story. But the combat zone became almost another character in the book. And it was interesting to me that I would try to contact journalists who had come in from out of state, because this case got so big that it was pulling in not just Boston journalists from the Globe and the Herald, but we were getting writers from Philadelphia, Miami, Baltimore, even Detroit. And we were getting writers from out of state, and they were all drawn immediately to the combat zone because they were being told, cover the combat zone, talk to prostitutes. And one fellow I spoke to, a guy named Joe Starita from a Miami newspaper, he remembered, 40 years later, he was telling me he was blown away by the combat zone. And he said, he came from Miami. He had also worked in New York. He had been in Times Square. He had been in New York during the 70s, which was, a really dangerous, deadly time. And he said nothing prepared him for the combat zone. He said it was just, it felt like it was boiling over because it was so compact. It was just dozens and dozens of strip joints, bar rooms, prostitutes, pimps, drug dealers, all condensed into 3 or 4 blocks. And he said it felt combustible, like it could just blow up at any minute. He said he'd never seen anything like it. He said in New York, everything is spread out. He said in Boston, he'd never seen it like that. Just, compact, it was just too much. That was the expression he used. It was too much, which, all these out of town writers would focus on, and they would go back to Philadelphia, and even the New York Times covered it. And, when the New York Times covers a story, it creates what they still call the New York Times effect. Basically, if the Times thinks it's worth covering, everybody gets in on the action. So once the New York Times covered it, it really exploded. But even the New York Times, they were taken aback by Boston's combat zone, which is pretty interesting to think about, because I had been in New York. I had been in the combat zone. I knew what those places were like. Now, of course, by the time I was old enough to get to the combat zone, it was past its prime, and there was no longer that sense of excitement, because a lot of people would go there just because it was like Coney Island, some people used to say, probably with a lot more crime, but it had a sense of fun. But by the time I was old enough to get there, the fun was gone, and it was really just a lot of crack dealers and drug addicts. It was no longer fun, so I didn't spend a lot of time there, and it was a unique place. And this was certainly not the only murder story. This was not the only murder that took place in the combat zone. There were quite a few others, but this one grabbed all the headlines. If you will bear with me, I'm going to read a little bit for you. I won't read too much, just 9 or 10 minutes. This is right at the beginning of the case, when a couple of guys stumble across the murder weapon. Sunday, March 6th, 1983. It was one of those damp, chilly mornings that made New Englanders feel springtime would never come. It would have been a nice morning to sleep in, but some folks were out and about. 2 unemployed men were checking out dumpsters along Interstate 95 near the Mansfield exit. Freezing temperatures be damned. There were empty bottles and cans to find and cash in. Massachusetts had just passed the bottle bill on January 1st of that year, but it was already common to see people scrounging around at rest stops along the highway. Grab enough empty bottles at 5 cents per deposit, you could keep yourself and cigarettes and lottery tickets for the weekend. Maybe get a 6-pack of Pabst Blue Ribbon, just enough to drive the new concept of bottle returns. The 2 men, Joseph Plotiger and Robert Jewell, approached a trash barrel that looked promising. On Sundays, the rest stops were always full to bursting with empties, all a result of the Saturday night traffic. They rooted around and lifted out a mysterious bundle. It was a brown plastic kitchen bag tied at the top with a knot. Inside was a woman's tan corduroy blazer. It was folded around something hard and lumpy. Wrapped snugly inside the blazer, which smelled of expensive perfume, were 2 items: a man's blue shirt and a small sledgehammer. The hammer was sticky. The men saw dark traces on the handle, like 2 large freckles of what they guessed to be blood. Stuck to the hammer was a single strand of long, dark hair. The clothing also had traces of what appeared to be blood. It was enough to send a shiver dancing up the men's spines. They debated calling the police, but decided against it. Why get involved with the cops? They put the bag back in the trash barrel and moved on. There were more dumpsters to check along the highway. Maybe they could be done by noon, home in time for some Sunday sports on TV. But Plotiger was bothered. Had that really been blood on the hammer? Had someone been whacked on the head? And had it been one mean mother of a hammer, the kind you usually see on demolition sites, the kind that smashes plaster out of walls. Within a few hours, Plotiger called the Massachusetts State Police in Foxborough and described what he'd seen. Later, a police lab identified the blood type on the jacket. It matched that of a missing woman named Robin Benedict. In Boston's adult entertainment district, she was known as Nadine and was rumored to make $1,000 per night as a prostitute. On average, 2 Boston prostitutes were killed per year in those days. The corpses turned up in the strangest places. One body was found in a pond in New Hampshire. Another was stuffed in a car parked outside a church in Lawrence, a city north of Boston. Some turned up in grassy areas along the highway. Some were found in their apartments. They died in different ways. Some were shot. Some were strangled or beaten to death. In 1979, a 26-year-old shoe salesman from the Boston suburb of Everett, Glen Breeze, received a life sentence for the murder of a 22-year-old prostitute named Karen Blumenthal. He'd stabbed her 43 times with a serrated steak knife. Now, unlike the Blumenthal case, most of the murders went unsolved. Although the term combat zone killer wasn't being used, Boston's homicide division wondered if a maniac was seeking victims in the zone, or maybe a variety of men were killing prostitutes and slipping out of town like phantoms. Detective Lieutenant Arthur Kelly felt it was unlikely for these prostitute murders to ever be solved. Look, he said during the Blumenthal investigation, let's say a John leaves the zone with an intended victim. You have to find someone who saw them leave, a witness who can definitely place the victim and the suspect together, and then get the evidence to prove that the guy is the one who committed the crime. No guy visiting the zone wants to get involved for fear of publicity. And the prostitutes have not been willing to talk because they've been scared of being singled out and slain themselves. 4 years later, it appeared Robin Benedict had joined the list of Boston's murdered prostitutes. Had she known about those other unfortunate women and their unsolved murders? A few of the bodies had actually been dumped in the greater Lawrence area, only a few miles from her own childhood home. Had she ever imagined that she, too, would come to such a grisly end? But how could she have known that one of her clients was capable of killing her, or that his name would be forever synonymous with nightfall, obsession, and sickening violence? I'm going to read just a little bit more from the next chapter, give you a little bit of background on Douglas. William Henry James Douglas was born November 1st, 1941, in Saranac Lake, New York. Known for its dry atmosphere and fresh air, Saranac Lake was where Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau established the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium, the top location for recovering tuberculosis patients. Trudeau's great-grandson, Gary, was a Saranac Lake boy. He went on to create the beloved Doonesbury comic strip. Albert Einstein spent summers in the town. So did Mark Twain. Despite the town's bucolic and sophisticated reputation, William Douglas's early life was decidedly lower crust. His dad, Bill Sr., was a plumber, while his mother, Eleanor, occasionally earned money as a maid. They struggled to get by. When William was 5 years old, they moved 36 miles south to Lake Placid. William later described Lake Placid as God's place. By all accounts, William was a clumsy boy and socially inept. The investigators who spent time with William would later describe him as a familiar type, the hapless kid on the playground who always dropped the ball, a boy whose mother had to rescue him from bullies. Lake Placid was a jock town known for ice skaters and rowers and hockey players. Such a healthy outdoorsy environment was difficult for the plump and uncoordinated William. Childhood neighbors and teachers remembered him as a lonely boy, unable to make friends. That his mother had a thick German accent during the years just after World War II probably made it doubly hard for William. Along with hearing jokes about his size, he was probably teased about Eleanor sounding like Hitler and Goebbels. William was encouraged to embrace the American dream of the post-war years, a time of prosperity and optimism in the country. Bill Sr. put in many hours on plumbing jobs and hoped his work ethic would inspire his son to better himself. But the American dream of the Douglas home was filtered through the neurosis of William's mother. Eleanor was a fussy woman who put a premium on politeness and decorum. She took jobs cleaning houses and hotel rooms and was often disgusted by the manner in which people lived and behaved. Eleanor stressed graciousness and modesty to her young son. As an only child, William was probably saturated by the constant influence of Bill and Eleanor. They doted on him, spoiled him to a degree. Doctors had told Eleanor that having children would be difficult for a woman her age. She was in her 40s. So William was a kind of miracle child. As one might expect, Eleanor sheltered the boy. She also preached to William about the importance of self-control, of being a clean and decent citizen. To keep William from picking up bad habits, she isolated him from other children his age. Now, this overprotection denied him the chance to socialize. May have also planted a seed in his mind that he was different from other children and that the world outside the home was somehow dangerous. The shape of William's childhood was set. Eleanor appeared to offer a stable environment, but her isolation and pampering of William kept him immature. Eleanor became a sort of mother manager, a concierge holding off the outside world, guarding William from scrutiny. In the meantime, he stuffed himself with her German meals and snacks and grew into a little oddball. That was how William spent his formative years in Lake Placid. Imagine a claustrophobic home in the sense that you're not part of society. Sometimes his sleep was interrupted by nightmares, scenes of bullies prowling in the shadows, ugly hands reaching out to hurt him. Children in such tight mental pressure cookers are given few ways to cope. But our future killer had two choices. He could be open and unafraid, or he could do things furtively. In time, he developed an instinct for the latter. There's no telling when William Douglas discovered pornography. He came of age during the 1950s and 60s, a boom time for smut in America, with the arrival of Playboy and its various imitators. Ted Bundy, probably America's most infamous serial killer, was born the same decade as William and often told stories about finding porn magazines in garbage cans. It isn't likely that Eleanor's boy would be digging around in the trailer court trash, but it is possible. Maybe, like Bundy, he saw a magazine in a bin, an image of a sultry woman with red lipstick gazing up at him from underneath the rubbish, the pouty lips calling out to William. It was easy for him to just reach in. And in that era, there was a raft of magazines depicting scenes of bondage. They were marked by disturbing covers that featured women hogtied or chained to walls with exaggerated looks of horror on their faces as they were being menaced by ominous figures. Even non-pornographic magazines such as True Detective and Detective Files often featured a bound woman on the cover. Such was the demand for images of women in distress. The scenes were obviously staged by a photographer, but were no less unsettling. Perhaps this was a reaction to the growing women's movement, with publishers tapping into the frustrations of men who couldn't handle the new breed of enlightened women. Whatever the reason, there was an audience for these vulgar scenarios. William Douglas was in that audience. William's constant isolation as a child may have hurt his self-esteem, laying the foundation for his future transgressions. At the very least, William was learning to escape into a world of fantasy. He was creating the sort of internal dungeon that C.S. Lewis, a Christian author who often dealt with themes of sin and desire, once termed a man's prison of himself, there to keep a harem of imaginary brides. If only William had been searching for a bride. What he liked were cheap paperbacks about innocent young women being forced to take part in orgies. He was especially interested in publications about people, men or women, being tied up and humiliated. It seemed all of Eleanor's preaching about self-control had resulted in a man with serious control issues. Okay, I'll stop there. That's the beginning of the book. Somehow Douglas would make his way to the combat zone and he would meet Robin Benedict. Robert, you're back. Do you have some questions?
Absolutely. So folks, we're going to take 15 minutes of questions from the audience. So please get those into the Q&A and into the chat. First question, Don, what are some of the challenges in writing a book like this? I know this crime happened, I think it's coming up on the 40-year anniversary in a few months. So it's been a while. What were some of the challenges in writing this book?
Well, the two main challenges were, it happened so long ago that unfortunately a lot of the people involved in the investigation have passed away. They were older people back then, so they were no longer around. So if I wanted to verify something, if I stumbled across an interesting bit of information or a quote from 1984 and I wanted to verify it, no one was around. Now, fortunately, if there were some people still around, there were some state troopers that were still around. There were a couple of attorneys that were still around. And lucky for me, they were all willing to talk. So they did help me fill in some of the cracks that I had trouble with. The other challenge was that some of the people that were still around didn't care to talk about it. Right. I was surprised that some of the journalists who covered the case didn't want to talk about it. One of them, I won't mention her name because she's still working, but she kind of scolded me. She said, you know, are you just going to make fun of the Herald? Is that your, you know, is that your mission? You know, you're calling the book Boston Tabloid. Are you just going to make fun of the Herald and the way we covered the case? You know, you know, I couldn't convince her otherwise, you know. And there were other people who would talk to me for a few minutes, and then, you know, we would set up a time to talk at length, and I would never be able to reach them again. You know, they would sort of pull out of the agreement. And, you know, I guess they had their reasons. Who knows?
And so there's been a couple of books written about this case. I think one of them was Missing Beauty. I think they were, most of these, I think they were written back in the 80s or something. And I think there was a made-for-TV movie about the whole thing too. How does your book differentiate from those two books?
Yeah, there were two books written. Missing Beauty was a lengthy investigation very well done by Teresa Carpenter, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning writer for the Village Voice. Again, another example of a New York journalist being sent to Boston to cover this crime. But her book was great. Linda Wolf wrote a nice piece for New York Magazine. But both of those books end in 1984 with his confession, the whole trial, and his being taken away to prison. I figured my challenge was going to be what happened after that. How did he fare in prison? How did he fare when he got out of prison? I had to dig around and do all of that aftermath. And I'm always interested in the aftermath. I am not a writer who gets to the sentencing, the judge sends the guy to jail, and then we close the book. I'm always disappointed in that sort of book. So I gave a healthy coverage of everything that happened after 1984. So that's what makes my books a lot different. And also just discussing how Boston has changed since then, and how crime coverage has changed. I went into that quite a bit. And also just the way news reporting has changed. And when I wrote this book, nobody knew what happened to William Douglas. Nobody knew, but I found out. So there's that little bit of interest, I hope, will make the book interesting for people who knew the case. And if you're just coming to the case, it'll all be new for you.
And your book also describes in great detail, some might say too much detail, the combat zone. And so modern day, what has happened to the combat zone in Boston?
It's all gone. It was replaced by restaurants and expensive high-rise apartment buildings and coffee shops, gourmet vegetarian places. If you try to tell somebody that, it used to be the most dangerous city in America, or the most dangerous neighborhood in America, which I think Life magazine once dubbed it the most dangerous neighborhood in America. No one would understand what you were talking about. They wouldn't believe it, because now it's just a typical overpriced neighborhood in the middle of the city.
So Don, let's take the last 10 minutes and talk about the case. We have some questions specifically about the case. Lisa wants to know, why did Robin's pimp go to the police? Isn't that rather odd?
Well, he went to the police because I think he was trying to get any suspicion off of himself. You see, if he didn't go to the police, he would have been a pretty good suspect. So by him, reporting that Robin was missing, it kind of took the onus off of him, though the police still suspected him for a while. And he also had some information that was very useful in the arrest of Douglas.
Susan asks straight up, why did he kill her?
Well, it's a very complicated part of the story. I don't want to give it all away. That would be, I guess, a spoiler. But there were a lot of theories as to why he killed her. The basic one that a lot of the old-time cops and investigators liked was he became very jealous of her and couldn't stand the idea that she was seeing other men or that she had a pimp. And if I can't have you, no one will. That was the theory that a lot of the investigators liked. But the more people I talked to, they didn't really believe that. That was sort of the TV crime drama version of what happened, but it was a very complicated murder. He of course claimed he did it in self-defense. He claimed that she attacked him over some money that he owed her, and they scuffled and he accidentally killed her. I don't think any of that is true. I give my theory in the book. Hopefully you'll all get a chance to read everyone else's theory and you'll read my theory, and you'll read his confession, which I found his confession and I put part of it in the book, so you'll know the story he was trying to tell.
And to that point, he was released from prison after only 9 years or so. Has he ever said what he did with the body? Diane wants to know.
That is the big mystery that remains. He claimed he put it in a dumpster, but they could never find the body. Now, my own theory is that nobody looked too hard for the body because of her being a prostitute.
Right.
Now that's just a theory. And of course, if you talk to certain investigators, and I did talk to some investigators, well, the state troopers that I spoke to, they said, well, yeah, absolutely. They weren't going to go looking for a dead prostitute in a dump, but the attorneys I spoke to, even they sort of said, yeah, they could have looked a little harder. At the time, they said it was going to cost too much money.
Right.
My theory is that they just didn't want to spend the money, because state money looking for a dead prostitute, it was not going to set too well, because that was also an election year coming up. Right. And one of the district attorneys was thinking about a career in politics. So the last thing he wanted was to be known as the guy who spent $1 million looking for a dead prostitute. So that's my theory.
Diane writes, I followed the Benedict case because she grew up in nearby Methuen. I happened to mention the murder to my then dentist. This was in the pre-HIPAA days. He told me that Benedict had been a patient of his and that the police had contacted him to get her dental records in order to identify her body if it was ever found. So little antidote there.
Well, that's interesting, but yeah, they wouldn't have found any teeth, that's for sure.
An anonymous, and I know you don't want to give spoilers, Don. On the other hand, I know some of this is all public information. Yeah. An anonymous attendee asks, did this go to trial, and did he plead guilty, and what was his sentence?
Well, it was going to go to trial, but he confessed.
Right.
And they arranged they arranged a plea bargain where he would get manslaughter if he helped find the body. And of course, they never found the body, but he ended up doing a little less than 9 years, I think, for he got off on a manslaughter charge. If you're interested in his prison life, I covered a lot of that, because I dug out, I found his prison records. I found a lot of stuff, and to me, it's very interesting how he, kind of survived in prison. Because there was a lot of speculation of well, how is this, milk toasty professor going to survive in Walpole State Prison, which was one of the nastiest places around, Right. But he found a way to get by. He was a very shrewd character, I have to say. He got by, and actually he kind of thrived in prison for the time he was there. He kind of thrived, which will probably piss off some readers, but that's what happens. And it affected local politics in a lot of ways when he got out of prison, and I go into that. Local politicians like Governor William Weld used that to stump for a truth in sentencing law, which at the time, if somebody sentenced you to 20 years, you could get out in 5 years. Right. but with the truth in sentencing law, you were going to serve your full sentence, and a lot of that was because of Douglas.
So Don, let's take a few more questions. Try to keep your answers to like 60 seconds or less, if possible. Sorry, we're up against the clock here. And we have so many questions. Marietta asks, many people who followed the case thought the professor's wife did it. What are your thoughts on this theory?
Well, I'll keep it brief. I think she knew more than anybody knows. And there's a very interesting spoiler in the book where someone says they definitely think she was part of it. So I'll leave it at that.
And did they have any kids together?
Oh, they had 3 kids. Yeah.
Right. So,
yeah. The Douglas, it was a family, you know, they were a typical family in the suburbs.
Let's see here. And so actually a couple of questions about the victim's parents. There's a question in the chat. How did Robin's parents cope with all the grief and publicity? And let me combine that with another question. An anonymous attendee asks, are any of Robin's family still living? And if so, did you interview any of them for your book?
Well, okay, the first question is they suffered terribly for it. Long after the case was closed, they were still being harassed by people who would send them horrible letters calling their daughter a whore, and it's a sick world we live in, so they suffered a lot for it. And the other question is, Robin's mother passed away, and her father's a very elderly man. There are other siblings who are spread out across the country. I did try to reach some people who were, you know, related to the family on both Douglas. No cooperation. Nobody wanted to talk. But I did find a couple of Robin's childhood friends. And that might be interesting for readers, people who knew her when she was, you know, in the drum and bugle corps, you know, and she was just a sweet kid. And somehow she ended up in the combat zone. So that's that.
Susan would like to know, what did he teach exactly?
He taught everything. He was one of those minds. Biology was really his specialty. But he was working a lot with very esoteric kinds of science, dealing with the tissue of the lungs, and how premature babies were born. They had trouble breathing, and he was inventing this new kind of tissue that would help the babies breathe. He was also doing tests, or he was inventing something that could be used where you didn't have to use animals in certain kinds of laboratory tests. He was really a force in the laboratory.
An anonymous attendee asks, did Dateline ever do a show about this case? Sometimes they cover old murders. Well,
you know who covered it a couple of times was the Investigation Discovery channel, which it's hit or miss. And I go into that a little bit, how they did a couple of short documentaries on this case. I'm sure at the time, Dateline may have covered it years and years ago, because it seemed everybody did. Chronicle covered it a couple of times, and all the Boston news networks covered it. That's for sure.
Patricia asks, what is he doing now since prison? And I guess he's no longer amongst the living, is my understanding, Don. Is that correct?
Yeah, he's not doing anything now.
Yeah, that's right.
He lived under the radar.
Yeah,
we'll put it that way. He really lived under the radar.
As a follow-up, and I know again you want to sort of avoid some of the meat of the book, but an anonymous attendee would like to know: did he stay living in the area, and did he stay with his wife?
No, he did not stay with his wife. They separated and divorced shortly after he was in prison. But like I said, he thrived in prison. and he had no shortage of female admirers, which which will blow your mind, I guess. He ended up living in Connecticut,
Right.
And he married again, but he really stayed under the radar. That's for sure. It was almost like he decided once he was out of prison, no one would be able to bother him or track him down or harass him. He really stayed out of the limelight.
And Don, two last questions for you. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how nowadays this crime probably wouldn't have gotten the press coverage that it did 40 years ago. Maybe that the victim isn't quote unquote sympathetic in the eyes of the media or whatever. But I guess what is it? And I know you talked about how the news now is more interested in social issues, racial issues, politics. I will say, though, every once in a while, a true crime case kind of captures the attention of the nation. I think we have one going on right now in Idaho where 4 college students were murdered sort of under mysterious circumstances. But why is it that you think certain cases sort of grab the media's attention nationwide, whereas, the other 99.99% don't?
Well, the news really is entertainment. And if a case has something that is easy to sell, that will get it more headlines. Like in this case, it was, the professor and the prostitute. It even has a name, an easy to remember name, I've heard about the girls that were killed in Idaho. But is that still going to be in the news a year and a half from now? Like this one was. Sure. I think these days, like a high school shooting, all right, or that kind of thing, they hit the news. Everyone's horrified for a day or two, but you're not going to be hearing about it a year and a half later. It's a different era. But yeah, I think the cases get on the front page if they're easy to sell, if they have a catchy headline, and if they play into whatever is the hot button issue now. Nowadays, Hollywood, if like a Hollywood person does something bad, that's like easy to sell, because everyone's looking for the next Weinstein type of case.
Sure. And we'll get you out of here with an easy one. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and giving us an hour of it. But where the 100 or so folks that were on the call, where can they find their book, Don? Where can they find your book, Don? Where's the best? How do they get their hands on this brand new book of yours?
Well, you just go to Amazon and you do a search for Boston Tabloid, and it'll come right up. You can buy it that way. It's available as a paperback, also as an audio book and Kindle. Oh, I think the audio book has not been released yet. I think that's coming out shortly, but you can get it in all 3 formats, or you can go directly to the publisher and order it from the publisher, which is Hamilcar Publications, HAMILCAR. But Amazon, I think, by this time in history, everybody knows how to go to Amazon and buy a book. And also some bookstores are carrying it. I used to have a list of all the bookstores that were carrying it, but there's some in Beverly, a couple of stores up in the North Shore that are carrying it. But I don't want to send anyone on a wild goose chase to hunt the book down at a bookstore. Amazon might be your easiest way to get it.
Well, your book does have the stamp of approval of Library Journal. The review says it's ideal for true crime collections, especially in libraries in the New England area. And the Tewksbury Library owns a copy, and I'm sure many libraries in the area do. So, Don, thank you so much. Wonderful job presenting your book. I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for being the primary sponsor. Want to again thank the libraries in Andover, Ashland, Canton, Clinton, Manchester by the Sea, Newton, North Andover, North Reading, Rockport, and Raleigh for partnering with Tewksbury. Folks watching live, I'll look for an email tomorrow with a recording, feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual author visits. So Don, thank you so much, and I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving.
Hey, thank you, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. It was a pleasure. I wish I could have seen all of you, but technology being what it is, you had to see me.
There you go.
So, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Have a great night. Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye.